as how many federal districts and what should the exact shape be, and even if they do, if they don't have the power brokers on side. So I think, to me, and this is a little bit my response to the civil society, there is no use in expecting the civil society to sort it out without the politicians sorting it out. Similarly, the politicians cannot be allowed to sort it out on their own. And it seems to me that we do much better, rather than pivoting between these two positions, to say that actually the peace building and the peace mediation job, in the broadest sense, I don't mean just with mediators, because the mediators are just doing the top down, and then there's all these other people doing these other connecting processes. But really the question is, how do you get those two processes to leverage out each other? How do you get the traction on the political process? How do you get them to do enough of a deal to get you to the next stage of the peace process without sewing up the political future into their own hands forevermore? And I see that as ultimately a management issue rather than one of a sort of high principle or strategy, in a sense. I do think if you don't have the solutions from the breadth of society addressing what people experience to be the problems, it isn't going to happen. The political economy question, well, you see, I think what's quite interesting is that norms aren't really doing it again at all, and I see this in a very narrow constitutional sense. So, we don't have coups anymore. We have authorised constitutional amendments that extend term limits, right? And then the international community doesn't know what to say, right? Because, so take Burundi, beautiful, beautiful example. We could not have invented Burundi as well to be illustrative. But you have, one side saying, well, we aren't really extending the term limits because it says about you can only be elected twice. In fact, we were all appointed under Arusha, so this is really only the second election. And then the other side saying, oh, well, you've extended the term limits, and the fact that you've done it properly through your constitution isn't here or there. If you've violated the constitution, you've had to amend. It's an abusive constitutional amendment. Well, then we're into sort of quite esoteric philosophical legal arguments about is there a doctrine? I mean, literally, this is, if you go to a similar conference to this of legal academics, they're discussing abusive constitutionalism and is this an unconstitutional constitutional amendment? I get that, right? So when you're starting talking about, and we are talking about this all the time, you go to ICON, you go to any of the legal conferences that deal with the same subject matter, you're talking about things like unconstitutional constitutional amendments, and whether people are violating the deep magic of the Constitution. That's a really curious sort of constitutional law. Look at the absolute hoops the African Union go into over Egypt and expelling it and bringing it back in. There's literally not a language and a legal way of articulating and combating the games that are going on. So for me, it's this fueling this new international order of a kind of disorder and unsettlement, that norms, which always can be gamed a bit, are now fundamentally part of the game. And in fact, this is a wider legal phenomenon. If you read Lawfare by David Kennedy or any of this work, this is the phenomenon. And I think for me, it sort of does pose some of the questions I come at, where I see myself as broadly benefiting from critical scholarship, and I'm talking more legal critical scholarship here, but at the same time, the point at which you say we cannot distinguish between arguments and it's all politics, the point we also give up any capacity to talk into that debate. And this is quite a problem now, I think. We literally don't really have a way of articulating the norms, and norms do not have traction on it, so you're having to sort of invent weird doctrines. So law has kind of run out in to me, a very striking and profound way. Maybe I probably all never really believed in law, but it never had run out quite this way before.
Another round of questions from this one there? Yeah? Mm-hmm. With the white watch strap.
When you were describing these main patterns, I couldn't help but think, I'm from Colombia, and I couldn't help but think the many different attempts and moments where we've had, peace negotiations and peace agreements.
There's been quite a few.
Yeah.
I think you win the record actually on the other one, which process is the most acute. I think it might actually be Colombia.
And of course we've had demobilization with paramilitaries, special jurisdiction for peace. We're having an ongoing talk with ELN. So we're having agreement on agreement on agreement. What can we do to get society to have a better understanding and a validation of those agreements? I mean, in the case of Colombia, my concern was with voting a referendum against an agreement and the manipulation of, the media, politicians, etc., etc. What does your work say about getting that message through to the average ordinary citizen, and what happens there?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, Randall.
Yeah. Your phrase about formalized political entitlement, I'm particularly interested in researching the case of Bosnia. When I read it, it was a really light bulb moment for me. I thought, yes, that's naming something which has not quite been named in that way before. I'm curious kind of whether you agree that that actually applies to Bosnia, because that seems to me like it does. So it's taking that as like a great case of description, then I wonder what's the prescription? Does that mean if we're in settlement discussions, you need to keep going and avoid this possibility of things which are kind of unsettled and temporary and turn out to be long-term, as I think as Bosnia has shown?
Karen?
Thank you so much for your talk. Really inspiring on many levels. But I had a question coming back to your final slide, where you had the opportunities and crises.
Okay, that's the one I never put any points in that. My spontaneous one.
So it was what you said rather than what was on the slide. But you mentioned these three potential crises or opportunities. The fact that there's no great power really present anymore in these negotiations in a real way. The fact that locally mediated agreements are potentially more stable, more creative, more localized, but do they reflect the political order we want or not? And then this third point about whether norms and values actually matter. And I was reflecting that all of those three crises or opportunities are embodied in the Timor-Leste case, where there was a settlement that was reached by national Timorese elites prior to the UN sort of forced building of the state. They had a Magna Carta of how they wanted their state to look and an agreed political settlement, but that was too leftist for the UN, particularly the US, to accept, so it was rejected implicitly. And many of the crises that followed in Timor since then relate to that moment. So all of these three things were present there, both crisis and opportunity on all three levels. And I wondered what your thoughts are on if local agreements are potentially more stable, but are contradictory to liberal Western values in other ways. Maybe I should qualify that as neoliberal. What do you do then? So the values mattered there, but they weren't the values that were acceptable to the international community at that time. So they undermined local settlement, produced another one that was unstable. So the US isn't in the picture anymore, and
Which is a bit of an if, but
a bit of an if, but it's a big if, as you say, right now. What kind of happens then? This vacuum when then other sorts of values may be pushed forward that may or may not be acceptable.
Okay, do you want that Trinity? I know that,
yes, that's fine.
that you're freaked out with threes, but
It's not, it's just when I do 3 points, I kind of feel like, can't really be 3, I've just imposed my Presbyterian sermon and stuff. So. Right. So, Colombia and the ordinary, so in the constitutional field, Tom Ginsberg talks about the need in these kinds of processes. He's talking about constitution making, but I'm applying it to broader peacemaking. Input legitimacy and output legitimacy. So you need legitimacy of where did this deal come from, right? And that's input legitimacy. And how is it validated can be a different way of getting the same sort of legitimacy through output, right? So in some senses where you've got low input legitimacy, people create and afterwards output legitimacy, like we're going to validate what came out of it, because the process itself doesn't validate it. Ideally, you want to build as much input legitimacy and not be left having to do it all at the around validating the output. I don't know a lot, but having observed the process a bit, it seems to me it was actually not as bad, as people say, in terms of trying to involve people in a remote process and trying to garner a bit of discussion. I think it came when I'm talking to people from other conflicts. You know, to me, Colombia is so much a lesson in the hidden costs of failure, right? But what you really lose through a failed peace process, and again, I think this is a much more profound thing. I've never seen any academic article. The point at which you have really lost, and the place where I've most seen it lost in random encounters I have, is to some extent Colombia and to a greater extent the Middle East, right? The point where you lose, everybody loses hope in the capacity of any sort of process like this to ever deliver, right? It's just another game. So everybody's always sceptical in these processes. They always know that things are more likely to fail than to win. But the point at which you really damage the future capacity of people to buy into the process, and I do think Colombia reached that point some long time ago in ways, and that seemed to me to be reflected. So ideally, I would always say, I'm pretty much don't like referenda anyway. It seems to me these are complex questions and choices that can't be reduced to binary questions on a ballot paper. I think that's with independence and Brexit. I think we reach, bad results, and they're very, very dangerous in peace processes. But I understand why it was chosen in that context. It was chosen for a number of reasons. So I think ideally you build the capacity. One thing in terms of answers, I am now increasingly persuaded about, there's a great article written about Nepal by Teresa Whitfield, who's now the acting head of UNDPA, and it's called Nepal's Masala process after sort of Masala curry, just looking at the entire mix of people that were involved. And the more I think about Northern Ireland and books come out from this random minister, this person you've never heard of, and there's part of you's very sceptical saying, well, they didn't start the peace process, I was there, they couldn't see them. And actually you read your book and you see this wealth of this amazing activity, and you know the person bit, and you know they did actually do all that. And it's never going to register on some sort of overall account. And yet I often think about who done it, Northern Ireland peace process, right? And think of Agatha Christie novels. Is it, Jonathan Powell says he done it, Jerry Adams says he done it. Somebody would say, if Mola Molan was here, with a bit more credibility, she might say she done it. Tony Blair says he done it. Southern Irish Civil Service say they done it. But probably Roger can say he done it. I can probably say I done it. Right, but what if this is Death on the Nile, right? Have you seen Death on the Nile? I've totally plot spoiled it now, right? The answer is, everybody done it. It's the most pathetic conclusion, like 50 people went in and stabbed this guy one by one. But that's a very bad metaphor for a peace process. But what if it was the complex tapestry of everything, right? What if it was that so-and-so worked within their community and the loyalists, that this person worked? Why is it so bad to water 1,000 flowers and hope that enough of them bloom, and hope that collectively they add up and create a will for peace? Now this is never articulated as a strategy, but it doesn't seem to me a terribly bad theory, and when you look at the processes that have worked, there quite often have been these multiple. And Colombian women started talking about pathways to peace, and I like this language. So say, the elites have to do their deal, and we totally get that, right? In Northern Ireland, civil society had it sorted out 50 times over, until the people doing the fighting found a way to broker peace. It was not going to go anywhere. I know, I wasted like years of my life doing that. It's a bit like these people in Cote d'Ivoire. We always found ways to get on. Women traded across the boundaries the whole time. Nobody was running around hating each other in that way, but until the fighting stopped, there was no capacity for anything else. So at some level, that has to happen. But the problem becomes if that is the only pathway to peace, and the investment in that part of the process is to the exclusivity of the other parts of the process. And I think for international donors, when I talk to them, processes get stuck. I would sort of say, have your wares in more than one basket, that the talking that goes on in this ridiculous talking shop might actually keep enough of the process on the road, at which, when the moment comes, there's a bit of thinking and a bit of homework has been done. So I do think that there's something to be said about that, and that is part of the answer, and that's not an easy package answer of do A, B and C and Bob's your uncle. It is an answer that says you've got to invest for the long term, and you've got to invest in dialogue, not being confident about where it goes, whether that's religious leaders, and you've got to think sectorally and then cross-sectorally. And I do think that investing in those processes that are seen as not critical is something that could just be done more. The formalised political settlement. So I have actually written an article on this along with Jan Hospital that's published now, I think, in the Journal of International Development. Yeah, it's Roger. And we actually use Bosnia as an example, and I think it's a great example of formalised political settlement. And I do sort of have an answer, right? So I sort of believe in an practical, an engagement in practical politics and practical possibility. So I would sort of say, as an academic, we try not to give in to the politics of despair on one hand, or go for the utopian projects of hope against reason. There must be some sort of academic project of practical reason, and if there is, that's a project I believe in. And it seems to me that if this is the way things are, if this is what these processes produce, that we can sit and bemoan it. And there is a lot of bemoaning in Bosnia by everybody. This is terrible, if only the settlement hadn't been with this. Well, that's fine, but the settlement was that way for a reason, which was that was the only way people could get the war stopped. And we can go back and pretend there were other counterfactuals, but there weren't. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Sierra Leone said this is horrible amnesty, but we understand why the government did this at the time. It was the only way that they could actually get the RUF to stop fighting when they were faced with what they were faced. This wasn't necessarily a bad and evil choice, right? So if we're in these formalised settlements, how do we engage? And I believe in looking for the possibilities and the leverage. So there are some, and I set them out in that article, but there are things like when you do have forms of group accommodation, so it's possible for other groups to mount claims on the back of that, right? So for example, women is a good example. The point at which everybody's there because of a quota, it's quite hard to be a liberal majoritarian Democrat and say we're not going to have quotas for women. The point, there's ways in which some of the inclusive dynamics and at the same time to exclude are susceptible to a language of Me Too, that you cannot set up an exclusionary inclusion. So, when I see people working in the conflicts, they're working at the margins of what they can push. And I think actually trying to think better as an academic community about what those strategies are, taking and connecting examples for where people are using them, for me that's a valuable project. And I think there are certain openings to formalise political settlement. The fact that the political landscape is up for grabs all the time, that you're not stuck. Look how hard it is to amend the American Constitution. You've got to get all 50 states to do it. They nearly got an equal protection amendment passed for women, and like one state voted against, and that was that forevermore. It can never be amended. In Northern Ireland, we amend the Northern Ireland Act at the drop of a hat. Direct rule comes in, direct rule goes out. Bosnia, there's constant flux. Now that feels very unstable and unsettling, but there are opportunities in that for some progressive gains that aren't there in more established systems. So I think looking at the opportunity structure for formalised political settlement to disrupt the traditional gains and the strictures of that settlement and to let a wider group of people in it is quite a valuable exercise. The East Timor, I just think he illustrated quite well the complexity. What I would say is there's a lot of, we use these terms very broadly, like liberal peacemaking. What we have to understand, I think states are not monolithic. This is the thing that's taken me a long time to learn as a human rights activist, right? We tend to have, this wide tapestry of humanity and then the state, which has a very unified intention and solidity and acts with complete dedication to this one unified intention and does X and Y simultaneously through all its institutions. States are big messy things where the military acts in a different way from the police acts a different way from the politicians. So liberal peacemaking is a bit the same. Sometimes it's not liberal, right? Sometimes it's not about liberal peacemaking, it's about the geopolitical military agenda. So there was maybe some moments of supposed liberal peacemaking in Afghanistan, but the point at which a state decides it's not in, and I'm always talking to policymakers about evidence-based policy, there's going to be some times when people just aren't they're not even pretending to do evidence-based policy, they're just saying, well, actually, in this country, in this situation, it's our geopolitical military connections that govern what we do. So I think we shouldn't confuse that with liberal peace building. Maybe if, we can say it's all the same thing, but there's different agendas come to the top at different times, and it sounds to me, and I just don't know enough, that that's a situation where there wasn't maybe even so much of a veneer of it. One thing I just would interject to that discussion about internationals, I'm not saying that I think international support is crucial, right? So that I'm not advocating a localised only situation. I think the function that internationals are needed for is to some extent to hold the ring. I think there is a holding the ring function around what the deal is and what the honouring of the deal is and what the capacity to have future discussions. And in fact, it's often as regards, this comes back to one of the other questions, as regards women, what often happens are, even where you get women's participation in the main deal, then as things fall apart, it goes into smaller and smaller groups again until the implementation, which becomes the renegotiation of the deal. This has actually happened in Northern Ireland with the great story of the Women's Coalition. All the subsequent deals that substantially reshaped it, women weren't even there at all, it just became Sinn Féin and the DUP, and that's it. So a texture that we had to the main process became unilaterally rewritten by two parties. But that didn't actually need to be that way, and it happened by default almost, rather than by agenda. So.
Let's have a final quick round of questions. You, Geroid, Zach, and Sonia.
Was there somebody else in me, or was I also? I was you and Geroid.
You're number one.
Right.
Number one always
I
Geroid.
thought it was you and then, okay. So you noted like the legal kind of wranglings and the way that they talk, about unconstitutional, constitutional changes and this kind of stuff. And,
Yeah.
somebody used to write a lot in transitional justice, including your own work. I mean, this reflection isn't about your own work, but I was always amazed by the fact that that kind of always happened, right? There seemed to be always this kind of discursive attempt to rewrite the law post hoc to make whatever they wanted to happen seem rational within the law, right? Like,
Yes.
I was always amazed by this kind of difference between the most responsible and those with the greatest responsibility. And David Crane kind of convinced me that this is clearly a difference. It's purely, I mean, it's obvious that there's an objective difference between these two. And I was like, no. But in his mind,
That
his
could
legal
just
mind,
be-
it had to be agree. It might disagree. But I was always amazed by this wrangling. Now, so if this wrangling is going on more and more, and then you talk about political, what's the term? Formalized political unsettlement within cases. But then you notice kind of at a global level, or maybe at an international level, we seem to be in and you seem to say kind of maybe it's a new norm, or it's going to be it's not just a moment, this could be the new situation that we're going to have to deal with, this kind of global unsettlement, with the US kind of retracting or disappearing, but are there foundational, so is the legal wrangling a product or a symptom of a bigger undergirding unsettlement? So like, you might think of globalization or climate change or these massive shifts that are happening globally that states but also civil society and the UN, we're all having to kind of negotiate. Is there something more fundamental than just the state or the UN or arguments about legitimacy or law or constitutions? Is there something more fundamental that's maybe other than political that's giving rise to this not political, not formalized unsettlement within states, but the more unsettled global kind of situation?
No, it's just political.
Let's take the questions and you can give a more considered answer to. I mean, that's a lot of question for. No, it's just political. He travelled down from Aberdeen. He needs more than that. We'll take Zach's question.
I'm actually all just really relieved when I said that.
Thank you for your presentation. It seems like there's some really good insights that are coming from the database. My question for you is, in your eyes, how do you see your database and the work that you're doing with it fit into the landscape or the constellation of Uppsala, USIP, NCOR, UN, the Peace Accords Matrix at Notre Dame? How is what you're doing similar or different? How are they complementary? Are you filling in the gaps? Or what collectively are these archives doing Peace Writ Large or whatever ends they have?
That's a good question. So,
yeah, I'm afraid my question is quite off the point. I was recently introduced to the Rosemary Simcoe's concept of agnostic pluralism or agnostic democracy, and I'm at very early stages of exploring whether it's possible to apply those concepts into this process of disagreement. If we apply that, probably the idea is that rather than supporting the local national kind of factions to resolve their conflicts, instead it's offer an opportunity to actually fight with peaceful means, or like political means. Have you come across any peace agreement previously that have been focusing on this type of process-oriented agreement? And then from a legal perspective, is there a challenge to form such kind of process-oriented peace agreement or peace process?
Good. And can we have just one last one?
Thanks very much, Richard. Really enjoyed your talk. My question is the political analysis of the reconstruction of order after violence has generally moved in the direction away from looking at the state or analyzing the state, but looking at plural sources of authority, at hybrid political orders, at informal norms and their importance, and has sort of characterized looking at the state and working on the basis of that as a sort of the iceberg view that you see the 10% to ignore that. From a legal perspective, how do you address the fact that a lot of the legal agreements may then be working with a small fraction of what actually constitutes legitimate authority in, and might actually be able to implement what you're envisaging it can?
Okay. So what was the first one? Sorry,
It was Garoy.
I got my answer.
Oh yes, sorry, you got your answer. Roger, what you did. So I don't think there is some big seismic tectonic plate driving it. I think what I would say in a slightly longer version is that the international order was always more unsettled than most domestic orders, and it had its slightly more settled moments of black boxes between states that were quickly unsettled. So, there's never been international society. It was always an incomplete constitutional order, and to some extent it was always unsettled in that the rules of changing it were always sort of more political and more legal. It didn't have that same regenerative political order to it. I think it is in a more unsettled phase at this time, and I think I do see that as being a sense of institutional failure coupled with, and probably if there is a political thing that accounts for it most, it is the increased assertiveness of both sort of BRIC and even the failed states. If you look at the G7 discourse, so it's a pushback from the receiving states of liberal peacemaking, international aid, saying we're actually now going to start owning this agenda. So again, I have very dumbed down analogies, but at the end of Pretty Woman, he says, I'm going to rescue you. What happens when the prince rescues the princess? And she says, she rescues them right back. So now states are doing it right back, and they're not doing it out with the frame of liberal peacemaking. They're using the language and the discourse and the narratives of it. In fact, the Cote d'Ivoire presentation of the panel before, I think, showed that really nicely. They're using it. That brings me to sort of the end question about the state, and is the state gone? So whenever you're talking about the peace agreement, you're talking about a formalised, whether it's the state, it's the kind of elite power holders, and of course what they formalise in it won't be even what they have agreed between themselves and what the real deal. There's always the deal and the real deal, and these are never exactly the same in any context really. But there is a kind of mistake, I think, in saying that somehow the other sources don't connect with the state in some senses. We got a piece in, I think, for the collection, had a great phrase of going about DRC is a failed state, but it's the most resilient failed state. There's a sense of which there's a resurgent stateness about some of these formulations. The other interesting thing is that the peace agreements are not just signed at the national level. So one of the things, again, that I feel our collection is not complete on, but where we have actually got a lot of documentation, are very localised agreements that are really quite interesting in themselves, in South Sudan, Somalia, interestingly in Yemen, and then astonishingly when we went back into Bosnia, there's all sorts of little agreements signed between the head of this army and someone, where it's really unclear that the person who technically is the state was the state at the time and was signing as any sort of state agent. So again, my sense is that if we really to look at documentation and agreement, we have a very much more complex tapestry and a lot of difficult questions that we can only begin to answer, like there's a huge controversy, are the Syrian ceasefires, or are they food for relief, capitulation, coerced deals? So and that's not really an answer, except to say, yes, in some senses I unashamedly look at that piece, because that's one piece, but I would just acknowledge it only is one tiny piece, but not tiny in the sense of it's absolutely critical to what else happens, because it controls the narrative for everything else. But yes, these other things do need to happen, do need to be reckoned with. That's two. The imperialism, I do think what I'm talking about has a lot of affinities with agonism and agonistic. And my own jury is out on this a little bit. So I propose the forms of engagement with the formalised political settlement as a practical politics of engagement rather than wishful thinking or capitulate to despair. But I don't think it's necessarily an ideal situation. And it doesn't fit with law at all, and it doesn't fit. And there are lots of, all of the deals do this to some extent, but I mean, Northern Ireland is always a very easy example. So Northern Ireland, on one reading of the deal, that's the reading that I would give, you had a quite fluid binationalism read. Now, we don't actually, there's a great phrase by, I think, Weiler, of saying that the dead hand of Westphalia comes in, because we only have certain ways of thinking. And I think this is true. So we have a phrase in the agreement of saying, we're going to cherish both the aspiration to United Ireland and the aspiration to union equally. But if you really think about it, that's a kind of almost untenable. If you think of the state as having a monopoly in the use of lethal force in terms of our traditional notions, what does it mean that to say the state will cherish equally the wish to depart from the state and have the state be a completely different state? And what does that, let's forget about what that means at an esoteric level. If you're going to set up a police force, and that police force is, let's put it very simply, it's the end of it, what would it mean for that police force to really embrace that binational vision? It doesn't work that easily, actually. Because we don't really have almost a vocabulary and an institutional way of being for that. So there is a sense of which the agonistic discourse will always get pulled back in the Westphalian frame. I do believe that the only way out of these intractable conflicts, and I do think we sort of see this, is to admit of questions that you cannot resolve in the short term, and to have to try to resolve them in some more peaceful way. And I think, creating some sort of equal playing field for people to resolve those in. So we can dismiss, if we take South Africa, we dismiss lots of ways in which it's more peaceful, but we can say that there's a more equal frame in which people at least participate in the conversation over South Africa's future that's more in line with the population balance. The same in Northern Ireland, it's failed in many, many things, but it has brought nationalism and unionism into a discourse of equality. And in fact, that's actually still quite an important change, even if it is not sufficient. It is a prerequisite for anything else. So these are incremental processes. Politics doesn't have an end point. It moves into different spheres. Where I have my doubts are, there seems to me there's some sort of Rubicon you need to cross, and I don't think we ever crossed it in Northern Ireland, where people start to need to try to do things that help the other side to move and forge some sort of joint commitment to a shared future. I'm not using that in the Northern Ireland sense, but some sort of common vision for coexisting. But that's the problem of humanity, isn't it, really?
And there was a question from Zach on where...
Oh yeah. Just remind me of what that was.
It was on
Oh, yes.
where
Right, so I think about this all the time. So where, and I have to be honest and say, you do these academic projects, and I cannot really explain why I do this one. So I have lots of worries about it. So I did partly create the database, and I've been doing it for many years before most of these, and I've been in collaboration with all of these projects for a very long time. In fact, through our current one, we built in roundtables, and we sit and we all meet together, and it's great because you meet like-minded people that agonise over coding criteria. It's like being a techie geek, and you get your little geek community, and we all love each other. And you swap, it's like having a collection, you swap collection to get a collection. But actually, one of it was that it should be easier for people to find out what's done. So like Sri Lanka always looks at Northern Ireland, but it might not be where some of the best, most creative things are. People in mediation all the time want to know what ways are there to enforce a peace agreement. It seemed to me it would be quite cool if you could push a button and get the examples, and that would provide a service. But yes, I have doubts about it because that undoubtedly then creates a blueprinting mechanism. I never present it that way, and I think the diversity of practice is such that it doesn't lend itself to blueprint. What I would say is that's a resource for political imagination, and that's the way I would like to present it. That's a resource. But yes, I can see the other side and the other argument that you are creating a self-generating practice and a reinvestment in the peace process, and I do worry about that. But I don't know if that worry helps anyone. But, how does it fit with the others? Well, there's only 3 databases that have peace agreements that are quantitative in their aspiration. I actually think our database is most useful for qualitative stuff, but it has a quant basis to it in that we do count and enumerate things, and we have a technical description of peace agreements, and we can quantify that. Some of those, I'm not sure, I sort of did that being both sceptical of quants and also looking at other people's and thinking, but if you did believe in that, you could kind of do it so much better if you just did this and this. Or, sometimes people that design these really good quants projects aren't always asking the questions of them that you think should be asked, and therefore don't design them to answer what you think are the interesting questions. So this was a chance for us to do that. So there's CROC, but it has, I think, now about 42 peace agreements that are the comprehensive ones. So firstly, what I would say is, inevitably if you push back and why you're doing yours differently, it's like a criticism. I would not be criticising CROC or Uppsala. They've been hugely valuable, and in fact, if you look at deaths and conflict databases, having a few that have done it a slightly different way is absolutely vital to the field, and I absolutely see what we're doing as complementary. The more we've had discussions with each other, you realise that what people are doing is controlled by what they're trying to achieve from their data. So for CROC, what they wanted to do was follow implementation, and it made sense to choose a subsection of peace agreements where there was clear commitments, and that was the comprehensive ones. But you can see from some of my data that, for me, that group doesn't necessarily make sense as a group, because people reach comprehensive agreement in different ways, through different documentary trails. So for me, that the project has integrity, but that group doesn't necessarily have the integrity it seems to have. Similarly, Uppsala is really interesting because it's taken me ages and lots of dialogue, understanding. They made a decision in 1975 to define conflict around where there was a state of incompatibility between the parties to the conflict. That they have to state, so their data on conflict is quite odd in respects. If there was a conflict that the parties hadn't stated, the incompatibility, it will not register. If the point at which they state it, where it will appear in their conflict data. So for ages I couldn't understand why they had this collection of 200 peace agreements that were both partial and comprehensive, but it seemed to me I could always think of other examples. But it's all being driven by where there was a state of compatibility and where the document resolved that state of compatibility. Now that has a huge integrity in terms of the totality of Uppsala data and is really good, but again it gives you a very random set of documents. So what we were trying to do, for what it was worth, and now I'm aware of the differences more, I wanted to understand processes of where people made public formalised commitments that moved them through a process before and after that there was some longitudinal history within conflicts. And I actually wanted, this sounds really mad, but I wanted a comparative framework. So the comprehensive ones don't necessarily give you a comparative framework for analysis. You're not necessarily comparing like by like, you're putting the label comprehensive comprehensive on. Sorry, this is probably far too technical for everybody. So I wanted something where I could see the spectrum of agreements and what was agreed in each time, even in different forms and trajectories of peacemaking, and begin to compare stages. And actually, the only reason I looked, everyone thinks I'm obsessed with agreements, and I admit it sometimes looks that way. But actually,
well, to have a database with thousands of peace accords, many of them partial, transitory.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is obsessional.
And there are arguments around tracing down, like there's 2 Sudanese agreements with both of the word borders in them that are a month apart. You can't actually find out, is this true? And I have had these moments where I'm sitting at my desk thinking, I'm sure like the only person in the world that thinks this is important or matters, and I can't really explain if it does, but like I do feel compelled to know, is this one agreement that newspapers reported at 2 different times or 1 or 2? So, but actually, what I'm interested in are the trade-offs that people make and the packages of trade-offs. Because when I started this work, everyone was looking at truth commissions or power sharing. And I was very aware from the Northern Ireland process that actually trade-offs happen across and between these issues. And I was kind of interested in how people traded off norms and political issues and some sort of methodology for comparing packages of trade-offs. And for me, I also am a lawyer, so I like to be a bit nitty-gritty, and it seemed to me that even if they're these fleeting snapshots, these moments of agreement where people formalise it are one set of compromises that at one point in time they thought would do the trick. And they provide, and then you've a jumping off point into what the surrounding politics really was. So maybe that just doesn't make sense to people, but for me, looking at the agreements is I would articulate it as the search for mid-level analysis between case study work that tells you the context, the small n work that's so granulated, but where everything becomes only its own case study and the comparative frame starts to go missing the more you show the complexity, and the large n quant stuff, which comes up with these huge, if you do this and this you'll have peace. If more women are included in the peace processes, they'll be 20% more successful. I don't even know what that means. Why is a peace process 20% more successful? It's like, it's a very odd, there's these very odd statistics come out. And again, I'm not trashing that work, but it seems to me there must be some capacity to have a comparative framework that doesn't move, that bridges between the broad quants, sweeping conclusions, and the granulated, very important work. And there's a slight attempt to do that in the database by having a sense of what the frames were. And also, like, there's a lot of, I was also pushback against peace agreement work. There's a lot of quants running off and saying, we've got this in agreement, let's correlate with deaths and conflict, without really looking at, well, there might have been an amnesty in that peace agreement, but actually the amnesty might have been passed 3 years later, quite quietly by executive order. So we've got also an amnesty bit of the project that sits separately. So again, there was my sense was that it would be really useful. And I think when people are using CROP and where they're using Uppsala, and they will and they should, but I think it would be really useful for them to go to ours and say, where do these sit in the broader tapestry of what went on? How many failed comprehensive agreements were there before they got to this one? It's very useful data on ceasefires. Actually, people are most interested in the ceasefire bit. Do lots of ceasefires lead to a better ceasefire or a worse ceasefire? How many ceasefires do you have before you get to peace agreement? Again, I'm not sure you can really do this statistically, but it's certainly interesting to have the data, right? And at least we've got that data. So I hope that we will be complementary to and supplementary. I hope we'll also be a point of triangulation. And we certainly have, and there'll be loads of problems with what we've done. All I can say is we've done our best. We've documented what we've done so we can tell people what decisions we've made. And we've also sliced the data up in quite complicated ways so that if you don't like the decisions we've made, you can just say, well, I'm not going to regard those agreements, and you can kick them out of our data. So I hope it will support some of the work that people are doing currently and stop everybody from having to go out and do the counting and documentation that we've done. And if they don't like decisions we've made about status on clear agreements, we've got unilateral agreements and unilateral peace processes, which is a sort of interesting one. But if you don't like that data, we've got labels, so you can kick it out and just do your analysis on the rest. So it's been, I have learned so much from it. It is a mad project in lots of ways, and I'm not sure I can completely justify my interest in it. But there is part of me thinks, even if it's just the archive, that has a kind of link. So I'll show you my website. I can't actually, I've forgotten my code word. And we haven't fixed this up, so it's a nice new interface. It's not live yet. The gender one is live, and it's actually not on the new interface yet. So this is all a work in progress, but it'll just be at peaceagreements.org. It'll probably go live without much fuss later this term, and then we'll start making a fuss in January. And hopefully, friendly people have looked at it and said, "Are you sure about this? Are you sure about this?" Our experience of putting the gender on live was that no matter how much we tried to get it right before, there's a level at which you have to put it live and get a bit of feedback to get it sorted. And the nature and scale of the enterprises, there will just be mistakes, so I have to just live with that.
Great. Before we thank Christine, I would like to thank everyone here for their attendance and attentiveness all day. If this was a proper conference, I would invite you to a drinks reception. Maybe in the corner, when you're trying to have a drink, there would be some interpretive dance. But this is the Manchester Peacebuilding Conference. We don't even provide coffee, so the chances of wine are negligible. But
But you'll be doing the interpretive talk.
yes. But do consider crossing the road to the